I got to talk about Basin so that we understand that basins are multidimensional. And so gratitude is sitting in a whole bunch of different ways with us. And so I have listed water, the basin of water. And that's where we all came from. And then I have the basin of first cultures or culture that came out of creation with first instructions, original instructions. And then I have the trails and passages that cross basins. We're very happy for those things. It ties things together. And then I'm going to get really short. There's the ecological basin. Can you imagine how much is in that basin and how many dimensions it has? Insects and birds and da 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 da. And we used to like spend a lot of time imitating coyotes. And, you know, if we had, maybe someday we'll meet in person again. We can do that. That was like lots of fun. The Earth basin, the geological basin, bigger than we can imagine. The spirit basin, the story basin, the vernacular styles basin. Yeah, I got a little basket over here. It's cute. See, little tiny little gift basket. Yeah, a few other things. And the visionary basin and the travelers basin. We were expecting travelers tonight. Hopefully they'll make it over the pass at some point. So, stories about books and about other stories are comment. They don't pretend to tell somebody else's story or some other culture's story. So that's why I said at the beginning, we're talking about stories and where was all that? And all the things, stories about stories with stories within it. So I'm looking at Craeft storytelling, Basin, many cultures that have been visited, and range, covering a lot of bases, taking all that wide experience together and seeing if it doesn't apply everywhere in the way of universal pattern. We don't pretend to tell other people's stories. We are talking about stories, not as original instruction. So I hope we're getting that. If we misrepresent cultural knowledge, which we are sure we might, please forgive us. We are trying to learn from a wide range of sources. And thus we're sampling. And thus I have a pile of books next to me here, which hopefully you'll see the story, the lettering in the right direction, and I see it backwards. Somebody just explained that to me. So the books, I'm going to show them, and then we're going to talk about them. This is the first one, Craeft, Alexander Langlands, and it's really quite awesome. I think I'll go on to the next page and talk about it. Alexander Langlands, a British archaeologist, teaches at the University in Wales, has done a great deal of discovering how things were done in the past and then trying to find people in the present that still knew how to do these things so that he could understand what he was looking at when he was digging in the ground. Because you can imagine a whole bunch of crafts, especially wood and cloth and woven things, baskets, they don't last very long. So he finds shreds and he finds segments and he puts them together and he talks about it. And what he came up with was that Craeft as Alexander Langlands calls it, is bigger than just a skill. It has to do with the basins you are in. What do you do it? How do you do it? What have you got at hand? What can you substitute? What works? What's going to last? How long will it last? I mean, all of this knowledge is held by people of place. It's held by people who are trying to make a living and sometimes just barely make a living. And so he really came to understand how amazing it is that humans were able at one time to do what they did without taking so much, within bounds, within sustainability. At hand, materials at hand, skills and cleverness, using materials at hand sustainably, finding a living within circumstances. So that's about as much as I'm going to say. You should read this book to get an idea of his working on his concept, his trying to understand what these people were doing, and then going out and doing it himself and getting a great deal of respect for what he's looking at in the archaeological record. I loved the part, because I like thatched roofs, I loved the part where thatched roofs worked great until the Industrial Revolution. And the problem was burning coal and industry throws a lot of sparks up in the air, and all the thatched roofs burned down. Several big fires in London, and then thatched roofs were outlawed. And we moved to slate and tile and metal. And so, but a thatched roof, which will last 70 years, a whole, couple of generations, is an amazing thing and is made from at-hand materials. So thatching really intrigued me in this book. It was very interesting. The words, the techniques he spoke about, never done it, but it was really very nice. So let's talk about basins again, because I want to get this Craeft, referring to Alexander, and basins, which I've mentioned a few times. And so you know what a drainage basin is, and in America they call them watersheds, but in the rest of the world, a watershed is the ridgeline that the water flies off of. So a shed roof is a roof with a peak that sheds water. But that's not the basin. The basin holds the roof, holds the ridges. It's the greater collection of flows and shapes. So basins can be thought about in a whole bunch of different ways when we're thinking about sources and interactions and multiple dimensions, because some basins are not a simple basin. Now, sheds I also use as fiber shed or quarry shed or wood shed, and not where you put it, but where it came from. So a basin can shed things, or we can drag things out of a basin and speak of the specific material as a shed within sheds within a basin. And this way we can start talking and counsel better with each other. We can be more poetic in how we understand where our living comes from, how we be in a place. Good. Materials, collections of tools and goods. What sort of chairs do we live in this valley? What are they made from? How do we know how to make them? This is Craeft and Basin. Now, Range is this book by David Epstein. I'm trying to get it so the light doesn't flash on it. And I'm going to talk about him in a little bit, but he means, how wide is your experience? Did you go through several different types of jobs before you found something that really worked? Well, maybe all those jobs that you went through taught you how to think in systems so that eventually you were able to land someplace and you surprisingly knew a lot about what was going on because you had been so many other places. You had ranged. And in social forestry, we talk about rangers. People with long legs. Yeah, me, I'm a ranger. And people who get around, who can talk a lot to a whole bunch of different circumstances, and who know a little bit about a lot of stuff. They have a big range. They are rangers. So a ranger covers a lot of ground and information. And a storytelling arranges a wide range of elements to gift us shelter and comfort and make the strange familiar. I already talked about Alexander. I think I'm done with him for a moment. Put him over there. How to persist with local materials. And if relocalization is the future, which it should be and might be by default, we might start thinking about survival with grace, about Craeft, Basin, and Range. Range, the book, David Epstein, that I just flashed up at you, he's a journalist, and he's a neo-Darwinist, and he's a techno-optimist. I'm trying not to be too nasty here, but I have some attitude about these things. The neo-Darwinists, a little bit too linear and reductive. Things are more complicated than that. And the techno-optimist, what David is doing in this book is he's portraying people who became successful after thinking they had failed over and over and over again. And instead they were growing and they were learning and they were developing their range. But what he seems to be looking for in this book, especially in the second half, is examples of entrepreneurs who fix things for us. And so that's hyper individualism. It's not talking about building culture. And I'm very interested in building culture because I don't think relocalization is going to work without culture. And I'm big on culture. So let's talk about culture as much as we can and think about where has this hyper individualism taken us? Why are we so thin-skinned in our identities? Is it because we're lacking the comfort and the holding of culture, the being held aspect, the, oh, I'm good, I belong here with these people? So I'm interested in those things. Maybe we'll return to that later. Meanwhile, I also want to suggest that the breadth of experience is so important. And sometimes we don't like that experience. In fact, I used to complain a little bit about things that happened to me when I was younger. And now I brag about those same things. What happened? I came to understand. It was like, oh, I must have learned something and maybe I grew a little bit or something. And David makes a really good example early in the book of this. He says, Remember that teacher who gave you a low grade and seemed to be torturing you as much as possible, and you really didn't like that teacher, and you thought that teacher was like out of line and being mean and nasty to you? Well, the evidence shows that actually that teacher is setting you up to succeed in entirely different subjects than you were studying with that first teacher. So don't complain, pay attention, and send a thank you note to that geometry or trigonometry teacher in 9th grade. So I like that because I want to be able to get off the hook for pushing people or asking difficult questions once in a while, although I try to do it politely and all that. But anyways, reading this book may have encouraged me in my bad auntie phase. So we'll watch that one. Wandering, the word peripatetic. I love that word, peripatetic. It means that you're traveling through, you're moving on. And so I looked that one up because I remembered it. Peripatetic, what a word. Lands the wanderer in a place. Well, that would be a set of basins, a place. So rangers still are in places, in basins. Range, as I will talk about with Christy Harris and the Haida in British Columbia, range also means learning from the others, in italics, the other, the beings that we have a hard time seeing and relating to, and that seem supernatural or so other and so strange that we maybe back off or something. But so many teaching stories of people of place talk about the others, because our relationships is to all sentient beings. In order to have wholeness, in order to have holistic management, in order to know anything or work together. So, all right, that's an important thing. What kind of range do we have of empathy for all the others? All the others that we can imagine or notice out of the corner of our eyes, flat in our face. So respect, even when we don't even have names, even when we're just surprised and amazed and don't know what to think. I love it that so many times natural phenomena get told in stories as known entities. Like one of my favorites in UFOs is flying saucers. Okay, so saucer, that's what you have your T on, right? Okay, so here's this thing up in the air, it's moving, it's a saucer. All right, but really it's other. And you don't know what you're looking at. And you shouldn't jump to conclusions just to feel a little bit more comfortable. Perhaps you could be amazed at the existence of others. And that would be a good thing, I think. That's respectful. Might even learn some etiquette and some taboos so that you don't make big mistakes that maybe your culture didn't tell you about, or maybe your culture did warn you about this. Well, more on that when we get to Christy Harris. So it's good to have reports from people like David Epstein, who appear to be moderns, industrialists. I'm not going to use some of the other words, colonialist, imperialist, that kind of thing, because they're other. And by reading books that are difficult for us, because we want to recognize we're not comfortable being stretched and having our buttons pushed. But that stretch, that's what that ninth grade trigonometry teacher did to you, is stretch so that you have better range. And so I'm doing that for you. I'm reading these books and giving you these book reports. So that's my effort at range and effort at reading, trying to listen, trying to understand the good information, the useful information in between the stuff that makes me uncomfortable. I guess I should notice when I feel uncomfortable, eh? So the basin of progress, as in modernity, and technology, quick fixes, glamours individuals seeking success. So reading a book, if you're looking to be a successful individualist and make some money, you should read David Epstein and figure out how to become an entrepreneur, perhaps. But you might get stuck in a channel, lose some range, and that could be a bad mistake. You might not be flexible when relocalization arrives in a neighborhood near you. Communitarian range can learn from everyone. So those of us who do want to think that we're a little less hyper-individualistic, we're not always that communitarian. That's pretty difficult. The society and the economics kind of work against all of that. Okay. Now I'm going to tell a story within a story. And this is the book, Raven's Cry, Christy Harris. And Christy Harris is an American who moved young to Canada, to British Columbia, and she fell in love with anthropology, and she discovered Frank Boas, an early anthropologist who has a mixed reputation, and all of his transcripts and his collections of stories and his collections of languages. And she met some of the remnants of these Northwest coastal tribes. And then she did her research. And this book, Raven's Cry, which was written, I believe, in the 70s, early 70s, is about the Haida people from the Queen Charlotte Islands, basically north of Vancouver Island and south of the Alaskan Panhandle. I've been up that way to the Johnson Straits. I kind of know what it looks like up there, so I could read this book and sort of get it. And the book has an introduction, a discussion by a couple of First Nations Haida people saying, this woman, Christy Harris, did a pretty good job as a white girl. Not bad, because she tried for the first time in literature to tell the story from the First Nations point of view, not from the exploitative point of view. And so they went, good job, Christy. We're looking forward to the report from the First Nations. We're looking forward to this sort of thing. And so the illustrator for her book is named Reed, R-E-I-D. I'm forgetting his first name right now. Bill Reed. And I found this book, which is a coloring book. And this is quite an interesting picture on the front here. Notice the white guy up on the totem pole. See him with his hat and his mustache? And then look in the other corner behind that, and you'll see a top hat hiding there behind there. And look, there's the doors. This is the Haida house door. And there's the pathway that goes to it. There's another door, a round door. This is all cedar wood work. And this is their incredible artwork. So this is a children's coloring book. And it's got commentary in it. And it's the closest thing I could find to a First Nations report, a task. Because what they're thanking Christy Harris for was to tell the story so well that the remnant Haida families were able to get their pride back and work on their language. And they are now rebuilding their 2 last villages and repainting the totems. And so this is a story of recovery after this adventure that happened for them. And bear with me, I'll see how much I can do of this. There were different phases. So before white people arrived, which was pretty late, it was in the late 1700s there in the Pacific Northwest, way up north, the Haida were a powerful people. Think of Japan or Britain. Island nations are strong. They're hard to invade. They have a lot of resources. They're really good on the water. And so the Haida were slavers. They ran their whole scene, their culture with slaves that they captured from neighboring tribes, Salish tribes and Tlingit tribes. And they treated their slaves well, but it was the slaves who powered the war canoes. And the Haida were also very strongly hierarchical. So they had royalty, birth royalty. They had very strong hierarchy, lots of that. But they also had potlatch. So they would do a leveling ceremony, potlatch, and sharing of riches, of goods. So there wasn't hoarding by hierarchy. There was responsibility by hierarchy. And that's complicated. I don't have time tonight to go into that. But think about that. They built incredibly good woodwork, boxes, houses, totem poles, and giant war canoes out of cedar. And they were dropping giant cedar trees. And they were doing all of this with stone tools. And they were very competent and ranged up and down the inside passage, as it's called. So then, they also had very tight taboos and etiquette. And there was a lot of reinforcement for behavior. And there was a sense that if they didn't keep everything together, things would go wrong. And there were lots of stories, which I'll talk about on the next page, I hope, that reinforced taboos and etiquette in order to hold a place in a complex set of ecological basins and to thrive and to survive. And like I said, they were well known for who they were. They were the big guys, the Haida. Then the first white people arrived. And what they were after was otter skins, because in China, they could sell an otter skin for an unbelievable amount of goods and then take those back to Europe and sell those goods. Mercantile trading in wooden sailing boats. Well, the first thing that they brought, the first things these white people brought to the Haida was iron carving and cloth. Oh my, cloth? And you might, when I look at that picture I showed you of a Haida house, those look like cloth curtains in those doorways, but I could be wrong. So this was big. The Haida were like, oh, Oh, otter skins, and we get these tools. Oh yeah, and guns. But things went wrong. Misunderstandings were taken, and the white guys did not respect the Haida. And the Haida were like, "Don't you know who we are? You know who you're messing with here? You better watch it." So the Haida stepped on the white people pretty hard a few times, and the white people massacred some Haida, and the Haida kind of came out even a little bit, except for the diseases. And we know these stories about how colonization was made more easy by these epidemics. Oh, epidemics. We don't know anything about that. Okay, so this revenge cycle was tough. But the Haida were so proud and so competent, and we're doing so well with these new tools, these guns and these iron chisels. Chisels, oh yeah, chisels, big time. Axes and chisels. And they made more and more canoes, faster and faster. They were able to trade. They were able to go further. They could get more slaves. So they were like, we're the business folks. We're like, we can deal with the white people, no problem, except smallpox. So at one point, 500 war canoes of the Haida went down to Victoria. And the Canadians, different from the Americans, were trying to protect these West Coast tribes and said, you got to get out of here. There's smallpox coming. It's coming with the gold rush. The guys who went into the river over there, they're really messing up. In southern British Columbia, there was this gold rush. In came all these miners from California, from the used up fields in California. They brought smallpox with them. The Haida were like, no problem, we're the Haida. But the Haida had, in that first or second phase, asked their shaman to go into trance. And the shaman had reported, all but 2 of our villages are empty. Our totems are falling down. And the royalty, who are responsible, listened to that. And then it happened. And the smallpox was deadly. Just a massacre, bodies on the beach. Abandoned villages. So they were down to 2 villages. And the royalty retreated to those villages. And then came the missionaries. And the missionaries said, well, you know why you're in so much trouble? Well, you got to get rid of this, and you got to get rid of that, and you got to change these things. And the royalty in those last 2 villages resisted. And that was good because they kept their story. They kept their art. And this one chief, hereditary chief, was born slightly crippled, a little smaller, but he ended up surviving. And all this just destruction to the Haida took place, and all this missionary stuff and alcohol, and it was really harsh. But this one crippled chief, if I probably shouldn't put it that way, but he became an artist worldwide known. The Smithsonian, every museum in the world. He created these slates. He made miniature houses. He carved war canoes. He just kept it going. The colors, the forms, the artwork, the stories that go with it, the whole basin of information, ecology, etiquette, taboo was held together by a thread. And Christy Harris was able to find the old stories that Frank Boas collected and find the remaining family. She wasn't even sure they would speak with her. And then she put together all these books. And the Haida were able to rebuild the beauty of their culture, the the strength of their culture, the lines, the basins of their culture. So it's a remarkable story. And I'm so glad that one of my students, Kara, gave me this book, the Mouse Woman Trilogies. So let me look at this last note here. Yes, I covered that pretty well. So that's quite a big story. And because the Haida were one of the last tribes to get rubbed, wiped out, and they got recorded, and their art was at such a high level because they had so many slaves, they could be artists, that they have become like an iconic highest civilization, highest art. In fact, their art is referred to as the finest on the planet, the best. And as you come to know their art, you can kind of see where people would have that sense, just looking at these things, even if you didn't understand how this went, how all this went together. So, talked about that. So the Mouse Woman Trilogy. It's a pretty hard book to find. It's expensive, in other words. I'm glad I was gifted with a copy. Since then, I was able to find the individual volumes, the three volumes that make the trilogy, library books, used library books. So I've built a little collection of these things. So Mouse Woman is the tiniest little grandma with the biggest attitude. And she's a supernatural being. And one of the things about supernatural beings in the Pacific Northwest is that they could appear as human. They could appear as an animal. They could appear, you never knew as you walked into the woods or stepped out in your canoe, whether you were dealing with the supernatural or just another fish. And so that sense of magic on the landscape and how it works, embodied in stories, teaches etiquette, teaches ecological behavior, gives you a basin of persistence, resilience, and survival. So to have Christy of collecting these stories gives us a little peek into what every First Nation had or has. These sets of stories of place and how it works. So this little grandma, Mouse Woman, she's super magical, and her specialty is getting young people out of trouble who got into trouble for no fault of their own. They just landed in trouble. They tangled with a supernatural being, or some bear decided they wanted to marry them or something, you know. So this little mouse woman would appear as a crippled white mouse trying to get over a log. And if you helped her, a voice would say, "Oh, please step into my lodge." And suddenly you're in Mouse Woman's lodge. And she says, "I see you're in trouble. Hopefully you have something for me." Because when you're dealing with supernatural beings, you definitely want to give a gift. And it turns out the gift that Mouse Woman really, really likes is those mountain goat woolly earring tassels that the Haida loved. All the Northwest tribes loved these mountain woolly thingies. Probably was good in wet weather, kept your side of your face warm. Anyways, you give this to a magical being by throwing it in the fire. Well, Mouse Woman's really quick. She drags it out of the fire. She shreds it with her little fingers into a big fluffy mass, and then she's totally happy. And then she fixes everything. So, you know, be nice to little white mice or to things that appear to be having a little trouble. Don't think you're so big. you might be dealing with a supernatural being. So, bunch of these stories, including the guy whose wife really was getting a lot of credit for her porcupine quill work, and then he wipes out all the porcupines. Right. There's a story to learn there and some taboos. And about how culture would be better. These people were like living out by themselves in a cabin. They should have been like talking to their elders. They might not have made this big mistake. So, there's a lot of stories here. She goes on in another book, The Problem with Princesses. And in one of those stories, she points out, you can't let these young people just fall in love with each other helter-skelter. It never works out. You got to do arranged marriages. And besides, you got to get the right clan and the right totem, and then you got to like help them out, make sure it works. So be careful with this stuff, you young folks. You really ought to come and talk to us, grandmas and elders. We can help you out. Yeah, we'll make sure it works. Don't blow it. So this is Mouse Woman. She really wants things to be done right. She wants etiquette. And she's going to tell, and there's these stories to teach you. Oh, this person got in trouble, and and this is wonderful. You hear these stories more than once as a child, you're going to learn lessons. And then when you get into trouble yourself, these stories will be in the back of your mind. And you'll go, oh. And you'll look down and you go, oh, I think it's Mouse Woman. I'm saved. Anyway, if you're a young person, that is. So I highly recommend. I think we ought to get her back into publication. I'm hoping that we all can learn from stories about stories about stories, and that I haven't traipsed on too many cultural toes, trying to make my point here and trying to help us develop a language of how to talk about these things, and how to teach our children, and how to do things in a way that is memorable, so that we hold on to the lesson, so that we learn. So one more book I'm going to talk about by Christy Harris. Looking at my watch here. All right, I'm doing okay. Once Again Upon a Totem is one of her earlier books. And it has two big stories in it. One is about the salmon tribes and the proper way to understand the relatives that we have as salmon. And this is so important. When you personify through stories, you come into relationship. All of life is our relations. These are our relations. And the salmon, we're related to them. In this story, a prince is adopted or captured by the salmon people and taken into their undersea villages. And he learns so much. And then the people learn so much. And they're much more careful with their salmon bones. Careful to tuck them under rocks in the river. And this is what the local Southern Oregon tribes have rediscovered, is this important salmon bone ceremony to get to return of the salmon, to respect the salmon tribes, the red tribe, the silver tribe, the big-headed tribe, all these 6 tribes of salmon up there in southern Alaska and northern British Columbia. Wonderful story. And the second big story that goes on for the rest of this small book is Raven. And Raven started out white. Then he stole fire to give it to the humans in order to steal their food. And then he got stuck in the smoke hole and got turned black. So that's why Raven is black. But Raven is creator, trickster, glutton. So all of us are creator, trickster, glutton. And by telling these stories about all this trouble that Raven gets in because he's so hungry and he's so desperate to pull tricks on people. And people just, oh, we've been tricked by Raven again. Why didn't we remember this? Why didn't we recognize Raven the way he was hiding and tricking us this time? Haven't we heard so many of these Raven stories? What's our problem? So wonderful. And I like Raven myself. So I'm a glutton in some ways. Sure. But okay. All right, potlatch. I'm giving it away. I'm telling stories, giving things back, collecting things, Basin, Craeft, range. So, how these are such solid stories. I've heard these stories, similar ones, from other First Nations cultures. The whole idea of trickster, the whole idea of really bad behavior, and the whole idea of creation, how creation takes place. It's not like a parade. It's more like a mud wrestling match or something. Creation's kind of messy. And, like Sky Woman falling from the sky, or turtle coming up with all this mud on her back. It's good for us to understand creation is ongoing. We might not recognize it. It has aspects that we really need to be humble with. And so those are those kinds of lessons. All right. Now I'm going to move on. Raven's Cry. Here's one of the Mouse Woman trilogy imprints from British Columbia. There you can see her. There's Mouse Woman. You have to see she's very tiny, and she's got this bark clothing on. Okay, that was her. And here's the once more upon a totem. I can read backwards. It looks backwards to me. I hope it looks forwards to you. And there's the prince and the salmon, and becoming relatives, coming into relationship with each other. And that's the Raven story in there. Okay, next I'm going to put up an entirely different book. And this is my own Basin. This is my own people, the Hicksite Quakers. And don't be too scared, but there is Mr. Hicks. There he is. That's it. And this is The Essential Elias Hicks by Paul Buckley, Inner Light Books, San Francisco. And, this is definitely a Quaker thing. And I'm a Hicksite from the Adirondacks. My mother told me many things that are now in this book. I never thought I'd have a source. So the story of this guy is incredibly interesting, and I think pertinent to our times, because his work, born in the mid 1700s, died in the 1840s, I think. He was very critical of industrialism and capitalism. And the Quakers, having already been for a couple hundred years more than 100 years on Long Island and New England, had already had a lot of First Nations contact and were isolationists. They had their own language, plain speech, dialect of English. They wore different clothes. The way that Paul Buckley called it was living within the hedge, living behind the hedge. But the hedge that the Quakers were trying to live within was leaky. And newspapers And articles and books were coming through from Europe in that time, in the late 1700s, that were raising up a great deal of discussion. And so Elias Hicks, even though he had several children, all of his sons died of a genetic anomaly. His daughters survived. His wife mostly ran the farm because he kept being released by the monthly meeting through unanimous consent to go out and engage in discussions with people in Philadelphia, in the cities, in small towns, in farming communities. And so he traveled widely until he was 82 years old. When he was 82, he took a small wagon and a horse from Long Island to Indiana and back. And you can't imagine what kind of trails that would be on. So what happened that was most pertinent for me is that the big Quaker schism in 1830s was between the Orthodox Quakers in Philadelphia and what came to be known as the Hicksites, but we called ourselves the tolerants, the people who were tolerant of others. And Quakers were very famous in the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary times in the Eastern US for being very bluntly rude and truth-telling, to the point where you could pretty much trust a Quaker even if you didn't like their behavior, because they would just let you know what was going on. Blunt, rude. And in fact, the way I joke, and I remember some of this, I grew up in this culture, you know, if you tell the truth and people don't react, you got to hit them with a bigger truth. Obviously, you know, they weren't listening or something, you know, pull out a bigger truth. So this was rough because what he lays out without having science, but by studying the only books he had, the Bible and other things, and by his own experience in nature and with First Nations, he laid out a critique which is holding up now. And that I'm speaking with you, that I'm telling you this story as a Hicksite, a survivor, one of the last, is remarkable. I mean, that my mother was able to keep a thread of such radical ideas through centuries and tell it to her children and have me take it out into the world and learn, you know, apply it to social forestry and do all this stuff. This has been a great gift in my life. And I'm so glad to have nailed it down to actually have sources. So this Elias Hicks book, it's a study. I mean, you could try and read it. It was a stretch for me. And oh my God, the Quakers are so radical. Don't believe in miracles. We don't believe in baptism by water. Heaven? Nah. It goes on. And this is all based on biblical study. And that's why there was a big trouble, because a big part of the early part of capitalism was the rise of Christian evangelicism. And it started in Britain with these revivals, and then it moved to America, and a whole bunch of Quakers went for the evangelicism because it meant they could get rich. They could go into business. They could become Quakers. They could become bankers. They could be, so I can't explain all of this to you, but I know that my family still feels that a big mistake was made when the radical evangelicals took over most of Quakerism. And so these days there are evangelical Quaker churches, and there are liberal silent meetings, mostly at universities, and those are the remainders of the Hicksites, those liberal Quakers. But I don't think they know where they came from. And I'm a working class farmer Hicksite. And my culture was smashed into the ground by the Rockefeller plan in upstate New York. And most of my cousins are full of shame because we lost our farms, we lost our culture. We were just massacred culturally. And so I've had that gift. Remember what I said about I used to complain? Well, this experience of my people has been a passport for me to have range and to have been able to teach in South Africa, Taiwan, Mexico, and work with indigenous people with respect. And often I've gotten a lot of respect back when people have figured out I wasn't, how do we put this, a normal American? What's the right phrase here? I'm not sure. Okay, so anyways, that's kind of my short version for you. The Quakers, these Hicksite Quakers, they had a basin of assessment and perception about, now we see more clearly much of what Elias Hicks was bothered by. We see what mess we got in. And it's amazing that there was such clarity so long ago to be able to put it out. And I find that wonderful, a kind of continuity, a range over time of knowledge, of etiquette and taboos. All right, I do have one. Oh, okay. Let me read this poem first. Here's a Hicksite poem that I wrote recently. Hick, back to basics, full of light. We do not recognize authority. Titles become graven images, inappropriate to truth-seeking. Same with social niceties. We need plain, direct simplicity. There is work to do. And being about a paradigm shift. Power down, be home. So there's a little taste of that. All right, now I'm going to go into science. Good, I'll have time for questions. I heard this woman interviewed on the radio. And the next day, I was visiting with my friend Doug, who's sitting over my left shoulder. And I said, I think I want this book. So he looked it up on the internet and he said, how did you know this book came out this morning? I went, what? Oh, well, order it anyways. This woman is hilarious. I mean, I had so much fun reading this book, but this is science. This is biological science. Oh, that's a hyena. Hyenas are the ultimate bitch. They'll bite your face off while you're sleeping. The hyena. So anyways, Lucy Cook has degrees in biology and is a journalist. And she found that there's a whole bunch that Darwin missed, mostly about females, women, females of the species. They were all considered to be kind of uninteresting, brown and dowdy, and, you know, they just like had babies and stuff, you know, what's to study? And so Darwin made huge mistakes. He just didn't get it. And then the boys club were like, what are you saying? What, huh? There's no female agency. The guys are in charge. And our friend Lucy Cook here has one hell of a sense of humor. And she goes out and finds the women scientists who straightened the boys out by having to do better math, better field studies, better scientific papers, nail it again, and nail it a third time. And then the boys were like, oh, maybe you've got something. It turns out, as I've been saying for decades, that women, females of the species, have their own agencies, and they have lots of tricks in their bag, and they get a lot of things done that no one had noticed. So when you read this book by Lucy Cook, every once in a while she throws in a kind of a social jab, like, oh yeah, if you're a spider and you're constantly eating your boyfriends when they come by, it's a little hard on the bedroom conversation, isn't it? So, I mean, she throws these jokes, she throws these lines in so that you begin to understand that evolution has a big range, and we're sitting in this basin of evolution. And to ignore the science and the biology and to keep going with propaganda and with bullshit is like not doing us a lot of good. And I love it because we really should understand how things work. What is the craft of being a female of the species? Well, there's a lot more to it than we have heard about. And there's really good science in this book, besides it being hilarious. But it is science, and it is scientific names and a lot of Latin. And of course, I ate it up. I thought it was wonderful. Let me see what my conclusion was down here. Right. These evolutionary basins, which we're all part of. I mean, our human body is actually an ecosystem full of different life forms. We're in a very giant, co-evolved evolutionary basin. And that basin, where was it? Oh, right. It haunts us. We see it out of the corner of our eyes, but we kind of don't want to look at it. What does it really mean to be human? What does it really mean to be a biological entity on this planet? Can we really cover that up? I don't think so. I think we can do a lot better than that. And a lot of the stories I've been telling you tonight are about culture holding knowledge and finding the things, keeping the things that would otherwise go missing because it's an inconvenient truth, or because something got skipped, or so lots of things can go missing. And I'm going to talk about the math of that in the middle, but I want to talk about we can dance these spirits that haunt us into the light. That's my vision of this. We should celebrate being messy biological entities. There's actually quite a good basin of being here. And it's amazing. And I've loved it all my life. Nature, oh yeah. Other humans, So take me to the woods. Essential and universal patterns imply principles that can be considered in council as we tend culture and tend ecosystem functions. We are part of the ecosystem. We're in relationship. We're surrounded by our relatives. We've got a lot to know. And as individuals, we're kind of stupid. It takes culture. And I have this little thread, this little shred of culture. My people have been in a set of villages for 400 years on the Vermont border. And thank goodness for my ancestors that they gave me these stories, that they gave me a thread so that I can have range, so that I can understand the nature of basins, basins within basins within basins, and so that I can develop the craft of storytelling to stretch us a little bit. So I'm going to read some kind of philosophical statements here, and then we'll have questions. Linear reductive accusations are not true, and they are not plain. It's a different type of simplicity. It's a false simplicity, linear reduction. Humans are tickled at these simplifications. In the face of complexity, we like a quick solution. Please put it in a box for us. We don't want to think about it. Sounds a little complicated. Thus, we're lost without culture and without place, because place is where the basins are, and the flows, and the shapes, and the flows. And that's what we're dancing in, the shapes and the flows. Oh, yeah, this is some of the difficult stuff. All right, we'll go down here. Maybe a question will come up and I'll get to that part. So you've heard me talk about this before, things that are missing. The term for that is lacunae in mathematics. And it turns out when you look at advanced calculus and systems theory, et cetera, finding out what's missing is really, really hard. Aldo Leopold in Sand County Almanac said, if you're going to mess with an ecosystem, you ought to save all the parts. You don't know what you're doing. Because the complexity is the relationship, the basins, the flows, the shapes. And thus, we need traditional storytelling and wisdom, because that's where things are kept so that they can't be forgotten. The pieces that we shouldn't forget, the missing things. And some of the phrases I've got listed here is ellipses, things that are missing. Left out things, reading between the lines, Robert Anton Wilson's snurds that you see between the lines. The unmentioned, incomplete discussions, obvious dodging. So very often I listen to journalism as a scientist and I go, why aren't they talking about that? And why aren't they mentioning that? This is like really short here. You're not getting this across. In order to really understand what's going on, you need a culture, you need phraseologies, you've got a set of stories, then you sit in council and someone puts out a phrase, a common phrase like walk in the light, friend. And everybody goes, oh, right, that's those stories. And you go, oh, okay, we're talking about, all right, let's think about it this way. So it stretches our counsel. It stretches our ability to understand. I love that obvious dodging, because some of my students have heard me talk about how a lot of what we do these days is surf and dodge. All right. I think I'll skip the freedom and liberty discussion unless it comes up. I think I've just gone through 9 pages of notes and a pile of books. All right, there it is. Can I drink some tea now? Anybody got any questions? Are we still recording? Looks like we are. So Karen's gonna come in if she can still hear us. And she's been watching the chat room. There she is with her Northern Lights. What you got, Karen?
Um, so we have no questions in the chat. So if you have questions, I would say unmute yourself and ask. And you know how Hazel is. Hazel loves questions. So
Because I go sideways. Watch out. You can unmute yourself to ask a question.
So we have a, hey Hazel, what is the freedom and liberty discussion?
Oh dear, I set myself up, didn't I? So Northern Europeans lived in village cultures for thousands of years and did basin tending, lived within their means, as it were. And then came the enclosures. And this is when property got judicially enforced. So the royalty hierarchy created ownership and property. And these things were not in the common understanding and aren't amongst First Nations. There's very strange concepts to people who are living in place with craft and with range. And so when the enclosures took place, the commons were claimed as property by the royalty. And the peasants were removed either by conscription into imperialist, colonialist armies, merchant marines, and then later labor forces. But anyways, the commons were closed. Liberty was lost. And in exchange for liberty, you got privileges. And these privileges were judicial. They were enumerated. There were names for them: the right to run pigs, the right to collect mushrooms, the privilege to do this. So a bill of goods was handed back to the people who were still on the land that, oh, well, we're the owners, we're the royalty by our royal birth, and but we're great and wonderful, and we give you these privileges. Well, those privileges have come to mean freedom. You are free to do this, and you are free to do that, and those are your freedoms. But they're hyper-individualist. They're your individual freedoms. You've lost culture, and thus you have lost liberty. So liberty is cultural. It's about people in place living sustainably. That's liberty. And when your liberty gets taken away from you and you get handed this bill of privileges and you think you are free, big mess, big misunderstanding. Doesn't work. And so to this day, deracinated, alienated, and fragmented Europeans who are now Americans, even having lived here for hundreds of years, believe that they have individual rights to steal from the king because the king took away their ancestral liberty. In other words, hyper-individualist people are traumatized. They're a wreck. They don't understand what hit them, but they're damn well going to claim their privilege. So one of the biggest things for Americans is, oh, I'll just go out on the government land and steal whatever I can find. Because it's mine. The king stole it from me. It's mine. I have the freedom and the privilege to take these things. Not very sustainable. Oh, was that a little bit of a rant? You wanted one, right? I mean, oh, wait a minute. I set it up. That's the craft of storytelling, right? Got any other questions?
Yes. So Kim asked, how do you envision transitioning into a potlatch society? Any advice for spread out rural areas?
We're not going to get to potlatch again until we've restored ecosystem functions. And thus we have fecundity and abundance. And we can skim surpluses and then share the surpluses through ceremonies like potlatch. So the way to get it going is to figure out what the surpluses are. Right now in the basin of the Little Applegate River, the biggest surplus we have right now is dead Douglas fir trees. Oh my God, tonnage, mega tonnage. And this is a gift. It's a one-time gift. Same thing with all these overgrown brush fields from the suppression of Indian burning. That's a surplus. It's kind of a thermonuclear surplus, but it's a surplus. And we can make a lot of charcoal. And then we can like give away the charcoal to put in our degraded agricultural fields that were run down by the mining, whenever that was, almost 200 years ago. So there's a couple of examples of surpluses that already exist and ways that we can rethink what our flows are, what our surpluses are, what we can skim and still be recovering ecosystem functions. So that's my short answer there. I hope that was useful. We have to start understanding what a surplus is, and we need to start understanding how to share and how to help each other. And a lot of Douglas fir, that could be used to build natural buildings. We have a big housing shortage. Just making that up, but that's an example. Okay. Got something else, Karen?
Yes. Let's see. What is flow and how does it compare to resilience?
Ha! So flow is understanding shed. At the beginning of this talk, I was talking about sheds within basins, things that move through the basin or down through the basin. So a flow crosses a basin or moves through a basin. And there's a lot of that. There's nutrient flows, there's air flows, there's water flows, there's animal flows, there's human flows, there's work flows, there's time flows. So flow is like a vector in physics. It's an understanding of movement going through, as opposed to a resource or a cache or a shape or a basin. So flow is a pretty big word. And what was the second part of that question, Karen? How does flow?
How does it compare to resilience?
When ecosystem functions are working, the flows are not being blocked and are hopefully cyclical flows or cyclical flows. And then resilience rises out of the inertia, the momentum of this complexity of flows, of shapes and flows. So resilience comes out of integrity, out of wholeness. And resilience doesn't work when you've lost a keystone species, when you've blocked a flow. Down with the dams on the Klamath River. And then the salmon flow. Yes, now we've got salmon that improves our resilience, etc. So there's a quickie.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. It's in my book. Okay. Something
So-
else.
I'm gonna, there's kind of some clumping going on here with the questions. Can flow become a vortex, more positive or negative? So still along the lines of the flows, and then I'll go back to the other questions.
Okay. Now we get into pattern language. Can flows become a vortex? Well, certainly. But that would be a sink. So a flow of nutrients, energy through photosynthesis, vortexes, carbon into sequestration. Just sink carbon. Or a deacyl gyre carries pollen and messages, or helps draw diurnal flows up the canyon, and then drops nighttime flows down the canyon, so that there's this tide of temperature and air and pollen and insects, and so this whole dance of the gyres and the vortexes and the deacyl movements and the Widdershins movements and all of these things working together. And it's a huge dance. And we could actually mimic these dances to understand them better, to understand them palpably in our bodies, dance through these things. And that's what a ranger does to get range, is they dance through the basin, across the basin. The ranger is a flow in a basin in order to improve his range, and thus the range of the culture, and thus an understanding of a humility in the face of the massive complexity of flows that are resident or necessary to resilience, fecundity, persistence. These are like bumper stickers. I'm giving you these really short answers, but this is how we do it. This is how we teach. We have these posters up. We have different types of flows up all at once. And then we can like point at one and point at the other and go, look, see this, and then this goes this way, and then check this out. And then people start to get it. Because what we need to do in order to do good work in ecosystem restoration is notice things. It's noticing. And we might not notice if we hadn't danced the dance. We might notice through multiple senses. These are just clues I've got for you, but when we're doing that eco work, sometimes we're making pretty fast decisions, and we can't spend a lot of time double thinking ourselves. We're going with flows that are through our understanding of these complexities, of these basins, and of the range of potential and possibilities. I'm just trying to be poetic here a little bit and do it short, but this is what we're up against with industrial extraction is commodities, really narrow flows. And what hasn't worked is multiple products. So social forestry has lots and lots of different products that they notice are surpluses, and we build our culture, our clothing, our tools, our things we eat out of all these flows. Well, multiple flows and multiple products are not easily marketed. It's a brokering problem. It's a sorting yard problem. However, complex multiple flows produce cultural artifacts. They produce vernacular style, and they replace consumerism. Ever heard of that? It's like imported things from factories that are into oversimplified flows and create lots of pollution and stuff and torture humans, and not in that good range way. So this is where culture comes in again. We can't do this complex understanding without dancing, singing, parading, sitting in silence, being surrounded by icons or posters, having really good stories, listening to a whole bunch of input from different peoples and different voices, and the others that I spoke about earlier, the others. And then we have all species council, and we can discover what our priorities are. And what we say in social forestry and Siskiyou permaculture is our priorities are beaver, salmon, and cultural fire. And that came out of a cultural process to understand there are totemic icons that help us understand poetically what this work is of relocalization and ecosystem function repair. Beaver in the headwaters, holding back the water tables. Salmon, bringing back phosphorus, nitrogen, micronutrients. Cultural fire, cool burning, recycling potassium, and breaking seed dormancy, and getting rid of senescent vegetation and thinning over exuberance in a periodic fashion. So thus, these three icons refer to a really big story about a place. And in this case, I'm thinking the Applegate River, and I'm thinking the removal of dams. But we've got getting the beaver back is being tricky. And we've got a lot to learn there, but it's key. And we know this if we celebrate it. So beaver, salmon, and cultural fire. Relocalization. I think this is our task. And in the best of all worlds, it will be a peaceful transition and we'll get some help. Relocalization will be facilitated by the empire, realizing what a mess has been made. And that is happening through the recognition of First Nations knowledge and the reestablishment. I was very happy to hear that apparently at last, after 250 years, the United States Congress is going to seat the Cherokee delegate that was promised by treaty in the early 1800s. And so these so many good things are happening in the face of what looks like planetary disaster. But in complex systems change, there's no predicting what happens next. Let's celebrate what we've got. Let's go with our heart and let's go with our spirit, because something will make it through the phase change and will be the new crystal seeds of reorganization. And I think we'll be happier humans when we're back in culture and not trying to pretend that we're our own island and that we have privileges and freedom. Oh, yeah, we do. Sure. Let's get liberty back through beaver, salmon, and cultural fire. Have I spit out enough yet? Yes, go ahead. Got another question?
So there's some questions and comments that kind of relate back to the rant. One says, "Great rant. Henry George would be proud. Can you elaborate on his contributions?"
Thank you. Yeah. Good old American Henry George.
Yeah.
Yes. You have a question? All right. We're giggling.
And then can you discuss our relationship with water and touch on the ways we scared off water and experience water scarcity?
Well, one of the biggest forestry disasters ever, and colleges come to Ashland to tour this, is called the Ashland Loop Road, Road 20. It turns out the Siskiyous are so bloody rugged that the only place they could build a road was along the ridge, the 7,000, 6,000 foot range of the high Siskiyous. So they built this road in 1905, and then they clear cut the old growth forests on this mountain range, and that was the end. The creeks dried up, the springs dried up, everything was gone. And when they tried to replant the Siskiyou Crest, total failure. You like going up there on the Pacific Crest Trail and looking at the beautiful wildflower meadows? Those were old growth giant forests that raked water out of the Pacific flows, dragged in the Pacific flows through these massive flows of air and humidity that forests create, and canyons, and all this stuff was working great. Took it off at the head. And no replanting has worked. It's been 100% failure of reforestation along Road 20. Now we think of it as a beautiful Siskiyou Crest mountainscape with wonderful views of Mount Shasta, and it's a disaster. It's a giant disaster. And this goes on and on. Now there's some bigger things going on, like the rise of the Cascade Mountains that caused the Great Basin to dry out. So there are geological forces that change things too. It's not just us puny humans cutting all the trees on a ridgeline. But this has gone on and on. We have built too many roads, compacted too many soils, took off too many forests, removed all the beaver, took all the salmon, dammed up the rivers, and all that water dynamics that we talked about a little earlier about the Deasil gyres and the Widdershins vortexes, all that stuff is a whole. It's a dance. It's the water dance. And the Pacific, the North Pacific, is really sensitive to it, about how the weather comes on shore and where it comes on shore. And so we're definitely out of our league. And the good news is we did this all pretty recently. And, you know, First Nations on this landscape have been through giant climate changes in the last 15,000 years that they've been here. And these are the same First Nations through that same 15,000 years. The Modoc, especially. The Karuk, the Yurok. And these tribes, these First Nations, have some intact traditional ecological knowledge that they are bringing back. I want to shout out massive praises to the release of the first 8 condors on the Humboldt and Del Norte coast by the Yurok tribe biologists, bringing back the creator condor. Oh my, am I looking forward to looking up and seeing something that I can't believe is there. And I'm so grateful that we have survival of so many things. Maybe there's only a few, but we can bring it back. This is our job, and we can help, all of us. But I think it's a cultural process. It's not heroics. It's not entrepreneurship. And there's no financial market for it. It's relocalization into basins with enough range of experience and enough understanding of flows that we develop craft. We become crafty. And in that craftiness, we find our humanness. We find our joy. We find our completeness by dancing the dance of craft, basin, and range. We're good?
Yeah.
I'm ready. I'm ready to take a break. I was promised a beer. I think there's one in the fridge back there I saw. So, any other comments at the last? Payush, thank you. Thank you, Payush.
Thank you very much.
Greetings. Greetings.
I have one question, Auntie
Yes.
Hazel, if you don't mind.
Oh.
So the context of this question is, something you said around individualism coming out of reductionism of complexity of the world. And I appreciated that perspective as well. One thing I noticed, as I move around in the world is that in the current world setting, the complexity of the world is big enough and such that people cannot hold it in their minds. It's very hard for them to open their minds to the complexity unless they cannot ignore it anymore. Unless it's right in their face, screaming and thrashing and so on. And it's to do with culture building, really. So my question is, how do we build cultures where individuals do not have the capacity to look at perspectives, to look at enough perspectives to be crafty enough, unless they cannot ignore it anymore, aka post-factual?
I think it's through cultural exchange. And I'm a little wary of overprotection of cultures at this point. And I think it's absolutely true that capitalism is culture destroying. And so as we can share between cultures, I think we're going to find we have way more in common than we were told in order to divide us up, like Herman Marcuse said, fragmentation and alienation, and you can sell as many refrigerators as you want. So it's coming together, and this is kind of interesting, right? Part of what Payush said was, in this greater world with all these cultures, and the individual how does this happen? I think it's happening through cultural exchange. Look at these small nations in this last COP's climate conference in Egypt, who stayed 2 or 3 days late and struggled to make their point. You know, they were heard. They were heard a little bit. We need to listen. We need these stories. I'm so glad I found these books. Hopefully mine will join them at some point. And we need that time to listen to each other. Where's that forum? Where does that forum take place? And I liked the Indigenous Grandmothers Council that our own grandma here was part of famously. So there's different ways, I think, that we can do cultural bridging that's really celebratory and that shows some commonality, because this is one small planet. And then we can come to the ministry of the future and make some big changes. I think these changes are just going to happen. They are happening. In fact, I think a whole bunch of changes have happened that we haven't fully understood or noticed yet. And oh my God, am I so happy to still be alive. I want to see what happens next. Yep. I'm on board. What's coming?
Thank you, Auntie Hazel.
Yay. Thank you. Okay. I'm tired enough. I hope we had a good ride. And I'll see you next year with another story. Woohoo! Yes.
All right, 34.
Do I undo record at this point?
Oh.